Okay, I'm going to make this quick, so I'm going to speak quickly. If I overrun, please throw something at me. Let's see whether this clicker works. So, what can Armenian grammar tell us about Parthian history? Well, I hope a lot. My idea is I'll give you a quick premise about what I want to say and what we have to take into account. We're going to talk about Parthia and Parthian to begin with very briefly, and about two eras of Parthian, and then the two key differences between those eras. And then we'll try to explain something that I'm here laconically called lost time, and that will bring us to Armenia. That's for that. So, my premise is that grammar can actually be quite interesting, not only for historical philologists and linguists, but also for historians. That in turn means that grammar distinctly is not boring, and that you ought not to be afraid of grammar. Because I have included as little grammar in this talk as I could possibly manage. The basics about Parthian that we then have to take into account when we want to talk about the influence of Armenian grammar on Parthian history is that Parthian is a Middle Iranian language, so not quite as old as Old Persian and Avestan, as Elizabeth has just discussed, not quite as modern as Farsi or Classical Persian, but somewhere in the middle. So we're talking the end of the first millennium BC and the beginning of the first millennium AD. Middle Iranian languages otherwise include Middle Persian, as the name might suggest, but also Eastern languages like Sogdian and Bactrian and Khwarezmian. Parthian, as one of the Western Middle Iranian languages, is the main tool of communication in the Arsacids, that is the Parthian Empire, so the predecessor or former rival, whatever you want to call it, of the Sasanians that Johann has talked about. It has also been used as one of the linguae francae of the Silk Road, and that will become important in a moment. The curious part is that Parthian is attested in two very different stages. Let's look at those. Right. The first window of attestation is in between 140 BC and 296 CE. These are mainly inscriptions, monumental and otherwise sort of important. People have left behind what they wanted to say about themselves. Many of the findings, however, are just ostraka, so little potsherds that can't tell us very much about grammar rather than about the lexicon. There's other indirect attestation of Parthian in the form of loanwords and other instruments of language in some of the contact languages, so for example in Classical Armenian, that's where I come in, and in Old Georgian. Break. Lost time, and now we arrive at the second window of attestation, which begins in the 6th century Common Era and turns up into the 13th century. Quite a long distance away also, namely suddenly in what is nowadays China, in Xinjiang province, in the Turfan oasis in particular. And here we find completely different texts. No longer are these Zoroastrian royal inscriptions or royal inscription of any sort, as a matter of fact, but they are texts of Manichaean literature. Some quite early compositions that must have been close to the life of Mani many centuries before, and some so-called compromised texts, as in texts whose grammar is a little dodgy, which have been composed and amalgamated later on. Now, why on earth do we have these different eras, these different attestation places? Let's have a look at it on a map briefly. Here you have the Sasanian Empire, the Parthian Empire, in 114 CE, with all the main points of attestation in yellow dots. Here is Turfan, where all the later attestations are found. Not immediately next doors. How are those two entities, those two locations connected? Well, you've heard it already by the Silk Road, and we'll come back to that later. So, key differences, we've set geography right there, miles, thousands of miles apart. Time, they're centuries apart, at least in terms of attestation, and this is where we have to put the exclamation point, and also in terms of content, royal inscriptions, administrative documents versus religious and some narrative texts. There are linguistic differences as well. I'm sure you'll be fascinated to know that the sort of lexical influences on later Parthian are coming from the Indian subcontinent, and so we have Gandhari Prakrit loans in these texts that we do not find in earlier strata. The morphology is even more reduced than it was in the second stratum than it was in the earlier one, which is something quite something actually, given that the morphology of Parthian as it stands is absolutely minimal. And in terms of syntax, and this is for which my heart beats, we lose ergative alignment slowly in favor of a nominative alignment. I could talk about this for another 45 minutes or so, but let's not. So, 3 questions that arise. Why do we have monumental inscriptions but only till about 296 CE? Why nothing after that? Secondly, so how do we account for the death of Parthian in the western part of the world, but its maintenance or revival in the east? And why is there no significant source of Parthian in these vassal kingdoms, so in the polities that were ruled by Parthian families or dynasties, so that is in Georgia and in Armenia? The first 2 questions can be answered relatively quickly. A language like Parthian that is so intrinsically related to a polity like the Parthian Empire will of course lose status once that empire falls or gives way to another one, like the Sasanian Empire. So the fall of the Parthians in 224 CE plays a role in that. The second point is that Middle Persian, which then replaced Parthian as the sort of language of administration of the following empire, was in all likelihood mutually understandable with Parthian. So maybe this is more of a dialectal question or of a diglossia question than it is a question of complete language death, meaning the language might have survived, we just don't have many attestations. Interestingly, we ought to note that after the fall of the Parthian Empire, the language is still attested in some inscriptions, but no longer on its own. We find it together with Middle Persian inscriptions, but we also find Middle Persian inscriptions of that time period without Parthian counterparts. Meaning that the Parthians probably were just relegated to second rank, and Parthian lost its importance over a period of time. The second question is, why do we have an attestation in the east, but in the west the language dies out? Well, we said already that Parthian was a lingua franca on the Silk Road. It was then also, in one way or another, associated as one of the languages of translation of Manichaeism, and for one reason or another, many of the texts that we have from Mani were composed and then translated in Parthian, meaning that it has turned into some sort of liturgical language for that religion, and thus survived in the later stages badly mangled, if you permit me that particular jibe. And so we just have a move of the language from the west to the east. The idea here being that attestation and usage are not necessarily going hand in hand, right? The language could have been used as part of an oral tradition without being written down. We also have to take into account that our sources may simply have perished, depending on what they were written on. Meaning that Parthian may have lived beyond its first attestation, if you like. So that leaves us with the third question: why no attestations in Armenia, in Georgia? I cannot speak to Georgia, so I'll speak to Armenia. Why, in a so long period of time where the Armenians were ruled by specifically Arsacid Parthians, so 198 CE till 428 CE, do we not have any significant Parthian attestation in Armenia? I suppose I ought to tell you something about Armenia first now. This is sort of a nutshell compressed by a neutron star, right? Armenian is an Indo-European language, attested first in writing on the Sinai inscription. You can imagine that Sinai Peninsula is somehow rather different from Armenia. In 480 CE, in manuscripts only much later, with the Milkir Gospel in the 9th century. For a very long period of time, Armenian was thought to be an Iranian language, which doesn't help us, especially since it isn't one, as Hübschmann has shown in 1875, but that already hints at something, namely that the language was so strongly influenced by other Iranian languages, and specifically Parthian, that it sort of could pass as an Iranian language. Have a map again. This is the Kingdom of Armenia in 379 CE. In prior centuries, the Empire of Armenia had actually extended far further into what is modern-day Turkey, even into the borders of the Holy Land, and further into what here is the Sasanian Empire. But they were beaten back and then retreated to their core territory, which is the Armenian highlands that you see here in red. More history. Armenians were actually ruled by Iranians for a significant period of time. We're talking more than a millennium. Not without interruptions, admittedly, but for an absolutely staggering period of time. The time period that concerns us here is really the Arsacid rule, which begins with the coronation of Tildat in 66, CE, but really becomes significant once the dynasty becomes hereditary. So once it is one family that keeps on ruling Armenia. This family was ruling Armenia when the Parthian Empire fell. So the connection between the big brother neighbor state and the rulers of Armenia suddenly sort of was cut to a certain extent. We have lots of sources that tell us there were political quarrels. Sometimes they also made truces, that is true. But more significantly, the Parthians were Christianized. The Parthian ruling class of Armenia was Christianized together with the Armenians in the beginning of the 4th century CE. And that set them apart from their counterparts, both Parthian and Sasanian, in the Sasanian Empire, who were, to a large extent at least, Zoroastrians. The other thing that we ought to take into account before we come to grammatical things is that Armenians and Iranians, especially of the noble classes, often intermarried. They had a tutelage system where Armenian children would be sent to Iranian families and vice versa, so as to foster good relations between the two ethnies, I suppose. Now, about some linguistics. I'll tell you about the interesting parts if you ask me later. Lexicon, morphology, phraseology, we just simply don't have time for that. So, to the significant parts. All this tells us that the languages were in contact for a significant period of time. What is much rarer than lexical, morphological, and phraseological borrowings are syntactic borrowings. Again, I come back to syntax. Again, this could take us 5 hours, but let's keep it to 45 seconds. Armenian makes use of Parthian syntactic patterns that are, relatively speaking, uncommon, certainly for an Indo-European language. One is this tripartite differentiation in function of the word Incan or Parthian vrat, which means that it can both work as a way of saying English self, so he himself came to Wolfson. It can also note a switch in grammatical function. It can also work as an anaphor, so think of English he when you've already mentioned someone by name a few sentences earlier. Armenian also has a canonical reflexive, which is distinctly modeled on a Parthian phrase. So ansenur, which is the Armenian phrase, his own body, his own soul, has a delightful comparison in Huish Garif or in Parthian. This also exists in other Iranian languages and in Indo-Aryan as well. So that is another indication that the relationship between those languages must have been so close that they would even have exchanged grammatical patterns. The third part, I'm coming to the end, is yeteh, the word that means something like that in Armenian, which can be used as a quotative marker. So he said that, and then the next sentence follows, indirect speech. More interestingly, however, both in Armenian and in Iranian can a word like that be used to introduce indirect WH questions. So I can say, and he said that, why did you do that? Which in most languages of this area and in Indo-European is a very uncommon thing to do. So it's unlikely that it should have arisen independently in both languages. The last part, and this is sort of the bump of my thesis really, split tripartite morphosyntactic realignment in Armenian. If you want to know what that means, we can have coffee. Basically, this is a fairly complex change in the way that Armenian constructs the perfect tense, which doesn't make any sense, in my opinion, if you just take into account Armenian on its own. You have to work some Iranian into that. Only then can we come to a sensible conclusion, and that means that in order for something that complex to happen, they must have literally, so the Parthian and Iranians must have metaphorically had tea together every day for a couple of millennia. What does that all mean? So because that contact was so prolonged and so intense, as indicated by our syntactic influences, we may have a situation where those people effectively amalgamated, where the Parthian ruling class said, well, you know, we're now Christians, we don't really get along with our neighbors all that well anymore. They don't like us either. You are, you know, my son is your warden, and you are his, whatever the opposite of that is, his parent in lieu. So maybe we are no longer real Parthians. Maybe we're sort of Armenians now. The Parthians, in my opinion, probably at some point identified as Armenians, stopped speaking Armenian as a Parthian as such, as a main means of communication, and just switched to Armenian, meaning that Parthian simply died of lack of usage in the public sphere. That's not the first time that has happened in the history of Parthian. It's also not uncommon in general that something like this happens. Think of the fate of French in post-conquest Britain. It was there and then it died because it was becoming less and less important. So, the lack of data makes it impossible to determine anything for certain, but this is what I think makes sense. And so maybe we can extend this idea of language context beyond Armenia and into the Sasanian Empire as well, Parthian just losing importance, and these speakers then switching to what was Middle Persian. And so I think, say, thank you, and Shashanara Kotu.